Welcome to the Divine Council Worldview Podcast. I'm Ron, and we have Mike with us. Thanks again, Mike, for joining us. We will be handling one more set of questions and answers this time around, and then we'll get back to our study in John. Only have 3 more chapters to go, Mike, and then we have to move on to another study. But last time, by the way, we had talked about theosis. That was one of the good questions we had. And you have a book that you just saw, and let me give you a chance to recommend it to look good.
So this is a book that I saw at ETS about 2 years ago. It was actually included in all the tote bags for all of us who were going to the ETS conference, which is one reason to, if you have a chance, come to ETS. You don't have to be a scholar. Just come by. I've met a bunch of you guys who have been listening to the podcast. You came up to me, just said hi. It was really cool. Like, oh, wow, you guys are actually listening and watching. So this is a book that they had included, and it's called Transformed into the Same Image, Constructive Investigations into the Doctrine of Deification. Deification is just simply the Latinized version of the word theosis. And so it's a set of essays from many scholars from different disciplines as they go into explorations on the doctrine of theosis or deification. One interesting article I thought was really kind of hilarious. You can kind of tell where this is going just from the title. Justification as Union and Christ's Presence. And this essay goes into an exploration of Luther's own exploration on the doctrine of theosis or deification, and even makes the assertion that Luther apparently viewed it, the way he described justification had a lot of parallels, if not connection touch points, to theosis. And so I think, for evangelicals, especially in certain camps that are very weary or thinking like, oh, this doctrine is telling us that we're going to become God. No, it's such a more intimate way of understanding that what does it mean to participate in the divine life of our Creator God, and how Jesus and what he did allows us to now participate in that very nature, the very nature that the Apostle Peter wrote about in 2 Peter, and that he participated in for all the years of his life till he ultimately was crucified himself. But he was participating in the divine nature of his Lord and Savior. And he's asking and telling all of us, we can participate too. And so I think it is a worthwhile enterprise to learn more about deification, about theosis, because I think it's a much cooler way to describe what we often as Protestants like to say, justification, sanctification, glorification. I think it's much better to understand it as this process and this spectrum that we are on this journey of becoming more and more like the King that we are following.
Very well said. Yeah, I wish I had learned it earlier on myself. Thank you. All right, first question. Nathan asks, why did Jesus turn water into wine? And he had a very simple question. Why did Jesus turn the water into wine in John 2? Going back to that story, when he explicitly, said that it was not his time to do so. Remember how he refuses early on. And his mother never even asked him to do it. Interesting way of remembering the story. The hour is not yet come, is how he says it. And Mary never says, do a miracle. And yet Jesus turns around and tells the men, pour out the water and see what happens. My first point is that Mary seems to assume that Jesus can somehow address the problem, but we're not sure. And I think we said this in the podcast itself, that in the ancient honor-shame culture of her time, running out of wine was a serious embarrassment. And so they have no wine. It functions more like not just, oh, by the way, we don't. It's, oh, what are we going to do? So I think Jesus sensed in her a fear, a sadness, a shame. And so he is going to respond to that, not this command to do anything. So it's kind of a response. Secondly, this hour, when he says it's not my hour, probably refers, as in most of John, to his death, resurrection, exaltation. In other words, everything's pointing to John 18 and on. right? Even 13 through 17, as we've been studying lately. So when Jesus says, my hour has not yet come, he's not refusing the miracle moment. I think he's saying that my full public unveiling of everything I'm about, and especially my suffering unto death, that time has not yet arrived. So the miracle will be permitted. In his mind, he's thinking, but the ultimate revelation of who he is and why he's come and all that is not yet his timing. I'm adding a lot of thought into that, and I don't know if Jesus thought through all that on that level. We don't have much there, right? I mean, John 2 is just giving us a very brief narrative. And I would, again, say because of this, or due to the deliberate quietness and the limited scope of this miracle, we really can't do a lot with it. I'll finish with just reading what I have. The master of the feast does not know where the wine comes from. I mean, he's not doing it to get a crowd. Apparently, only the servants, Mary, and the disciples understand what happened. So that's why John even says, this is the first of his signs, Jesus doing this in Cana of Galilee, and it manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Seems to be a very specific miracle for a specific purpose. It certainly didn't hit the front page of the newspaper that day and did not cause widespread belief from what we know. But it is interesting. It's just an interesting miracle, and Nathan, I'm glad you picked up on some of the oddity of it. But may we say, as an answer, we just don't have enough to sometimes know the answers to these kinds of questions, and we just have to enjoy the presentation of a story that probably is there because those who saw it couldn't help but say, "Hey, let's include this in the Gospel of John." So, anything you want to add, Mike?
I think I agree. I agree with you that we don't exactly know why, but I would also point out, typically the Gospel of John is seen as being written well after the Synoptics, right? And within the Synoptics, especially the Gospel of Mark, you get this sense of like the secret gospel, like the secret, like don't tell anyone, or him quieting unclean spirits who want to declare out loud that you're the Son of God. I know who you are, and just sort of like, we gotta keep this on the down low because my time hasn't come yet. I'm not supposed to die yet. I'm not supposed like all this of like trying to control the information as much as possible before it gets out. And so I wonder if in some sense this is a little bit of a callback or a reminder of this was very quiet at the very beginning. No one knew who Jesus was and was supposed to be that way for a while. That no one who he was. What I did think, it is kind of funny as you were mentioning about how in some sense this was a faux pas of running out of wine. It reminded me actually of my own wedding when you said that, because so funnily enough, right, when my wife and I got married, for folks who may not know, I'm ethnically Chinese. I'm born in Boston, lived here all my life. And so in many ways, I'm kind of always one foot in one culture and another foot in another. And one of the things when you get married as a Chinese American is after the wedding, typically there's food, a lot of food. And so one of the things that my wife and I had wanted for our wedding was we wanted it to be more geared in a little bit more of a Western sense, because that's kind of how I think of myself more of. And the same thing with her. And so we understood there was this expectation. There's going to be food right after the wedding. Well, there was going to be food after the wedding, and it was the banquet later that night.
Okay.
And so one of the things that is sort of a compromise that we did, and it really was almost a last minute thing. I contacted and contracted with a Chinese bakery to bake us, if I'm remembering the number correctly, around 250 Chinese, basically, these Chinese pastry goods, these baos, these buns, more than enough that we thought, calculation wise, of at least 2 per person who was coming to the wedding ceremony. And so like after the wedding ceremony and after we said our goodbyes and we, head out to do some like wedding photography and other things before the banquet that night, there would be some food for people to grab and head out, kind of have some hours to just kind of relax. I only hear about it later, maybe a few weeks later after the wedding, that my mom was furious because apparently they ran out of food.
You had a John 2 moment. Oh boy.
Yeah. And apparently we didn't order enough. And so she was upset with me about that. The other thing, however, that she conveniently did not mention, that my friends who were helping with the distribution of this extra food after the wedding, was that several of my family members grabbed more than their own share. So that it ended up that, yes, my mom was embarrassed that we ended up not having enough food, that some people apparently didn't even get more than one of these pastry goods. But I also had family members who apparently took 3 to 4 of these, right? So it's like, of course, it's not going to work out because that was not what I had actually calculated. Because I apparently forgot human beings are human beings. And so it is what it is. So the fact that Jesus comes in the clutch at this moment, like,
yeah, you might have just done it out of, shame.
Like, I really could have used a miracle like that if I had known what was about to happen. Like, please, can you just multiply the number of Chinese bakery goods for me at this moment so I can avoid the wrath of my family?
I'm glad you have a John 2 in your memory. Sounds good.
Oh boy, didn't even realize that's what it was, but yeah.
Thank you. So Hunter has a great question. I had mentioned this, I forget when, but he says, in a podcast, you mentioned Elton Trueblood's book, The Humor of Christ. Can you expound further on Jesus' humor? I couldn't find it today. I left me some time. I left me a little time to go look, and my Jesus section is quite large, and I couldn't. It's just a slim paperback. But I had done an overview of it a long time ago for my Bible doctrine, or my Life of Christ class. So I'm going to talk about it in a moment. But he asks, can you further expound on Jesus' humor? How can a DCW help us? I love this. Faithfully and carefully expound on Jesus' humor, especially as it relates to his incarnation. Remember, we believe in a fully human Jesus. And when it comes to this idea of humor, and this is, again, I did this a while ago to summarize the book for a class a long time ago. His point was basically 4, I think I have 6 points. Number 1, Christians have forgotten that Jesus was funny. This is, again, Trueblood's argument. Trueblood believed that centuries of religious art, liturgy, and piety created an overly somber picture of Christ. Boy, he's got that right. I mean, when you watch any Jesus, now I think the Chosen has done a good job, from the little I've seen, to present Jesus in a bit more of a human light. But he argues in this book that we often miss the obvious humor because they assume Jesus must always, be standing behind a lectern in very serious, heavy tones. He's not a comedian, not frivolous. Again, I think there's time for frivolity, but I doubt it during his teaching. But that his argument was that humor is a natural part of humanity, or healthy humanity. Effective teachers use it. Jesus' humanity would naturally have included it, and playful intelligence, he calls it. Number 2, Jesus frequently used exaggeration for effect. And so things like, and it doesn't maybe sound funny because we've said it with long faces, but the man with the log in his eye. Now, it's a comedic moment, for a guy to walk up to you and say, you've got a little speck in your eye and this log is hanging out of a guy's eye. That's probably how people took it, with a bit of humor. Swallowing a camel while straining out a gnat, Matthew 23. Squeezing a camel through the eye of a needle, uncomfortable for everyone involved. My favorite is blind guides of the blind. There are times, and I don't have them all figured out, and nor does any historian, but we have evidence that Jesus was quoting sometimes from Socrates and from some of the aged, wise people before him, so that maybe some of these were already on the plate for witticisms that were available to the to the average speaker. But the point is, I think that when Jesus said this the first time around, we would not have worried about laughing. I think we would have laughed with him. Number 3, humor was one of Jesus' weapons against religious pretension. A major theme of the book is that humor often functions as a form of truth-telling. True Blood sees Jesus' wit especially directed at hypocrisy, pride, legalism, spiritual blindness, self-important religion. Rather than dry philosophical argument, Jesus often dismantled opponents through irony and comic reversal. And now, again, these, like the great seeking the best seats and then finding they have the worst seat, these kind of ideas. Heavy, heavy theology, but one of his arguments or his weapons against this kind of pretension would have been the ability to slip in a humorous comment that had people chuckling or at least quietly snickering to themselves that Jesus is onto something. And every good speaker does this at times. Mm-hmm. Number 4, and I'm not going to read it, but we all know this, the parables often contain comic, what we'll just call comic elements. A man saying, I'm asleep in my bed. Would you stop banging on the door? Right. And I mean, it almost is comical by the time you're done. And elements of surprise, reversal, exaggeration, all these things, I would say, would have had a comedic effect to some degree when Jesus was giving them. Humor and seriousness are not opposites. One of the book's most important insights is that humor and tragedy can coexist deeply. I've often found this, and I'm not good at it, but when I've seen it happen in my presence, I'm appreciative. At a funeral, someone can stand up. I often recommend having an open mic time for people to talk about the deceased. And our hearts are heavy, and then someone will tell a story that just has us rolling, and it felt so good to laugh at that moment, even though our hearts were heavy. So I do think that True Blood is just thinking psychologically here that some of the heaviest themes of all time, of course, are in our Gospels, like crucifixion and suffering. But that does not mean you can't have humor and wit part of the story. And number 6, Jesus was attractive to ordinary people. Never forget that from what we can tell, sinners enjoyed being with him. People are drawn somehow to his presence. Now, you don't want to make him the most handsome man in the room. What's most videos, they don't say they're doing it, but most. And I back when I was teaching college, I had as one of my assignments in my Christology section was of the different papers you could write. This is before the invention of AI, so who knows how they do it now, but one of the papers they could write was, in 3 to 4 pages, how would you recognize Jesus in a crowded room? And I left it at that. I was always curious to see what people would do. And I'll never forget one of the students had in their paper, I would be able to tell by his piercing blue eyes. And I remember circling it in red, saying, how do you know that one? I mean, in other words, I wasn't upset, but I was just curious what she was going after, happened to be a she. I have done this. I think I mentioned this along the way, that you can offend a crowd by making Jesus human. Do you ever notice this, Mike? I was in a sermon, or I think it was a large auditorium. I forget where I was at. And I said, what if Jesus had a lisp? What if Jesus, and I started to name things that were not sinful, but were just, they were not things you want in your leading man kind of thing. And at one point, it was a class, because a lady or a girl said, she was shaking her head, and I said, what's up? Or something like that. And she said, don't do that to Jesus. That was her words. And all I was doing was making him less than Cary Grant or whoever you want your leading man to be. Because in her mind, I guess, she had such a view of him that to make him normal or to make him less than the best in the room was not right. It was actually hurting his reputation. And I would yet recommend, and this is part of True Blood's argument, that in being a humorous person, what we mean is he had a good sense of psychology, and yet he was also normal, and that people didn't always follow him. You have some people who are opposed to him, yet you had some others follow him. So joy, warmth, emotional vitality, conversational ability, those kind of things we want to say about Jesus from what we can tell. But let's not make him out to be something he isn't either. So good question. As he ends the question, how can a DCW help us faithfully and carefully expound on Jesus' humor? And really, and I'm leaving out some of his question where he added, this is Hunter, he added other parts of his personality as well. Are there ways that we can appreciate other parts of his personality beyond even humor? And I guess I've just been explaining it here, that keep Jesus human. Make his, and this is for me, Mike, I would love to hear your thoughts, but if there's anything that would be, shall we say, poetic, it would sound just like the Jesus that, wouldn't you know, we have, that the Garden of Gethsemane moment was not being met by a brave heart kind of resilience, like I can do anything, I'm strong, I'm, let him have me, I'll show him a thing or two, the John Wayne kind of tradition. But what if Jesus' personality hated pain? What if he absolutely hated pain and he was not good at it, shall we say? That's not a moral thing. That's a psychological thing. And I think it's very possible that when he prayed in the Garden of Eden, in the Garden of Gethsemane, he was literally, and I think this is important, frankly, to the story, he was literally at his wit's end, even considering what was going to happen in the next hours. I think that fits the story very well, even as painful as that sounds, and that he wasn't just biding time psychologically. So those kind of things, I think, help us ground the story in a humanity that is necessary for what's going on. So, anything you want to add before we move on?
I guess to just touch upon that last part, how can a DCW help? I think we forget is that the incarnation is, especially in the context of the Second Temple period of Greco-Roman thinking as well. I mean, this is why we have later church fathers, like early church fathers like Athanasius, in his writing on the incarnation, where he just explored the mind-blowing idea that the human vessel is a worthy vessel to contain the very presence of the Creator. That for a Greco-Roman mind that assumed human flesh or any really physical matter that by default in their minds was just tainted, evil, wrong, impure. And yet, some reason, you're telling me that the Creator thought that the human body was actually worthy to contain him? Mm-hmm. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about Jesus. Yeah. And I think so many times we kind of portray the fact that we often more likely have a Docetist kind of perspective on Jesus.
Right.
That we assume that, like, that in some sense also reflecting back onto us, that we're disgusted by our own bodies, that we're disgusted by the human experience, that it's infallible for us to think that the Creator would actually be fine being contained in a physical human body.
Yeah, good point.
And that he would not be disgusted by it.
And a humorous one at that. How's that?
Yeah, and I think that's
yeah.
I think that's just one of the things that we always have to always kind of grapple with, is that Jesus was thoroughly human.
Mm-hmm.
And that there is nothing shameful about it. If anything, even part of what, Athanasius's thought process is, if the human vessel is indeed worthy to contain the presence of God, then maybe we really need to rethink, what does physical matter? Maybe creation is not evil. Maybe creation, physical matter, is not impure. Maybe it really is, as what Genesis 1 and 2 says.
Right.
It's good.
Yep. We have 1 foot on the ground, 1 foot in heaven, and God is not offended. Yep.
And so I think that's a thing that we constantly have to kind of rediscipline our own minds when it comes to thinking about matters of our human bodies, matters of this world, in that maybe we have been more influenced by a Docetist type of thinking than we would like to admit, or even ever realize that we were kind of caught up in. Yeah. Because if we find it hard for Jesus to be humorous, yet it's easier for us to think that Jesus was hateful or angry all the time, I think we have a very distorted version of the Incarnation then.
Yeah. Well, we will, I think you'd agree, we will work on our understanding of the Incarnation all our life. We'll never get it right because it just blows our minds. Something we'll celebrate in heaven for eternity. Thank you. Number 3 out of the 4 we have again today. David asks this, again, well thought through question. Isaiah on more than one occasion mocks idols as being inanimate. We've talked about that. While the ancient understanding of idols was that they were vessels that in some sense connected the human to the unseen world. Interesting way of saying that, and I agree. What do you think? Do idols themselves have power? David's question is deeper than it might sound to me. It's not saying, well, we know they're just wood and stone, and we know that the gods can operate separate from wood and stone. This is a third spin or another angle on those 2 points, and that is, well, what about that idol itself? Is there something possible that we may be looking past, that we should really just stop and wonder why that second commandment may have interesting possibilities? I've come up with 4 points. Again, this is a thought question to me, but there's some history involved, and I've done some work on idols in the past, even for my own dissertation on this. Number 1, here's my opinion. Well, this is actually history here. Idols were often treated as actual, localized presence for spiritual beings. Remember how this works. I would carve the piece of wood, and it was wood, but then I would take it to a priest in a village, leave it with him overnight. He would invite the beneficence of a deity into that piece of wood, the opening of the mouth ceremony, they called it. And then I would go back and retrieve my idol, now having in some real sense that God connected. I guess, now we're struggling for words, but let me start reading. In the ancient Near Eastern world, an idol was not normally thought of as just a symbol. Through rituals of consecration, there it is, that mouth opening ceremony I mentioned, the image was believed to become a dwelling place or earthly point of manifestation for the deity connected to it. This background helps explain why the biblical writers, and think Bible now, could simultaneously mock idols as wood and stone, which they were, while also warning that real spiritual powers stood behind them. They served their idols. There's something deeper there than just say, why didn't he say serve their gods? Because there's something that idol probably welled up within them, some kind of connection to the worshiper. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10, remember this? Idols are not gods, he knows that, yet sacrifices offered to them are offered to demons. He connects in some real way the danger, and maybe it's just psychological on the level or, on the front end, but we're thinking past that. Why would Paul not just say, hey, psychologically separate the two? He doesn't. He just says you are sacrificing, quote, to demons. So the biblical logic seems to be that the object becomes spiritually dangerous because it is tied to a real rebellious spiritual being. And I think there's just something deeper there than we often give it. Number 2, idols could defile sacred space. Remember this interesting, and this is an interesting way to look at it. You could put an idol in a place and defile it, and there must be something about that, or even the human person. Old Testament repeatedly treats idols as contaminating objects, not merely mistaken ideas. Ezekiel especially speaks this way. Ezekiel 5 and 7. Idols defile Yahweh's sanctuary. Again, if they weren't real, if gods were not real and the idols have some meaning, then why would Yahweh care? The stumbling blocks of Ezekiel 14. In Deuteronomy 7, Israel was forbidden even to bring carved images into their homes lest they become, quote, devoted to destruction like the idol itself. So there is that intellectual error side of it, but there seems to be something deeper than that. Proximity and participation, I call it here as well. Interesting question, and I think there's some interesting possibilities. Number 3 out of 4, idols may exert spiritual enslavement. Here's where, think just of the psychological element from the human side, that you are being, well, again, I think it's deeper than just like a dollar bill in your pocket or money, or the hope of fame, things like that, that there's something about that piece of wood or stone that could actually bring a person to act in a certain way. Enslavement. Let's see. I'm not going to read any more, but I just think that's an interesting point, this enslavement idea or influence. And lastly, biblical narratives. This is the narrative now, not just poetry, but biblical narratives sometimes portray idols as objects associated with real events. Kind of some weird ones here, folks, but like in 1 Samuel 5, the idol Dagon, remember this, repeatedly falls before the ark of Yahweh and is shattered, almost as though two realms of sacred power are colliding. That's how they would have interpreted it, right? I walk in, I see this idol of Dagon bowed down and shattered. It's telling me that idol was something more than just a statue. That interesting story of Rachel stealing Laban's teraphim, which seems to be a rough way of talking about idols. There is a specific meaning to that term, apparently, though. The narrative assumes these household gods mattered enough for Laban to pursue them. I need that back. Why does he think that way? Again, there must be something more. In Acts 19, this is, again, it's easy to look past this, but they burn magical books worth enormous amounts of money. Because, why? Why can't they just say, hey, it's just a dumb book, it's just a physical piece of paper or whatever, papyrus, whatever? No, there seems to be something beyond the material. So, great question. Do idols have power? I would recommend whether they do or don't, it doesn't matter in one sense. Humans can attribute to them power. And even on the level of psychological naivete or just dependence on something, God would say, don't go there. So I think there's possibilities, and that's enough for me. I just don't think idols are wise. And you can see them in cases in museums and such, and they look harmless. But I'd recommend that there's something there. So. Any thoughts?
Can I share a resource from my screen here?
Oh, yeah. Let me stop sharing here.
So I think I've mentioned this before in a past episode a while ago. It was about also, because we've had questions before where this was asked of like, why is it seems like idols seem to be very real, but then we get to the languaging in Isaiah and Jeremiah and other books later on where it just seems like they're treated as though they're nothing. And so there's always been, this is kind of one of those constant challenges that happens with like the DCW kind of theology or against, Mike Heiser's work. I would highly recommend checking out this monograph that came out in 2019 by Thomas Judge. Other gods and idols, the relationship between the worship of other gods and the worship of idols within the Old Testament.
I like the title.
Folks yeah, it's quite the title. But, Ron, you and I know when we see a book, a monograph in particular, that is completely green with gold lettering, it's from a particular series of scholarship that is studying, like really just like, this is, you talked about studying the gravel. This is studying the pores of the gravel.
It's probably a dissertation, right?
Right. And it's a really deep study. But one of the great things about this question that this, the scholar Thomas Judge kind of went into was, how was the languaging about the gods and about idols? Was there a difference between before the fall of the Northern Kingdom, before Assyria essentially destroyed them? And was there a change in how those words were used post destruction of the Northern Kingdom?
Mm-hmm.
And I think he very successfully kind of showed that there was a significant semantic shift in how the languaging was used. and that we often don't observe because we sort of forget that the destruction of the Northern Kingdom was a thing. We forget that the exile to Babylon was a thing. We forget that the return from Babylon was a thing. It sort of gets lost in our minds because we don't realize how significant these events affected the writers of the biblical texts.
Yeah.
Now, if folks want a good, concise summary of what Thomas Judge's work is about, may I recommend checking out Carrie Griffiths, Carrie, who works with us in the foundation.
Yeah.
She wrote a review and article about Thomas Judge's book and gives a great summary of what his whole entire thesis is about. So I would highly recommend checking out her article on her website, Genesis Marks the Spot, and just learning a little bit about this, because this, I think, answers a lot of the interesting kind of pushback that folks may have towards a Divine Council worldview or against Dr. Heiser's material. And, it's just one of these things. This is kind of what happens over time, is that you realize there are other scholars who have been exploring these kind of questions, but you may not know because it's just, filed away in an obscure green covered book with gold text. And you may not even know that it's there, that someone researched this. So
very good.
I would point folks that way.
Did that review.
Yeah. It's a terrific, great summary. And it really helped answer, at least for me, it sorted a lot of these interesting things of like, was there something that happened in the way that they understood the word idol and understood the words of gods? And like, why is it Isaiah and Jeremiah are making fun of the idols and gods? And this seems to be that there was a significant difference in how they understood it after what Assyria did to the Northern Kingdom.
You're making me just page through chronologically how the story goes, because they don't make fun of idols before that. I mean, there's that passing comment in Deuteronomy, but that could be an editorial comment too, made much later, right? That these beings, these things can't do this, that, and the other. But early on, you've got Laban pursuing Rachel, needing his teraphim back. Why'd you have to steal my gods? As he yells.
Well, and the whole entire thing with Dagon, right? Like that's significant. That when you have essentially the angels essentially taking out, like the way one of my Hebrew professors, we did a class through 1st and 2nd Samuel, exegetical class, and had to write one of my first exegetical papers. When we got to that scene, he described it as though the way that they found Dagon was that Dagon was running from the angel that took out his sword and sliced off his head and sliced off his hands. That it's like, oh no, like I'm about to die. And that was the way that I remember my professor describing it, of like the way that they found his body, essentially. It was just like the most gruesome way you could think of, like what you could do to an idol god.
I hadn't thought of that.
It was really funny of just the way that scene is described. That it's almost like, they just came upon like a murder scene.
Yeah.
And that this
I'll have to
box,
reread that one. That's interesting.
That essentially this box, the Ark of the Covenant. What in the world? Like, it was almost like this horror scene of like, you see the box and then you see the statue of your God completely decapitated. And you're just left wondering, what happened? How am I supposed to imagine what happened here?
Stories have power. That would have been that would have been one to remember. Cool. Got one to go. One question to go. It's a big one. I'll give you my opinion, but boy, even as I read it, I think of how much this could go on, and it will be part of, again, so many things we do in this podcast over the months and years to come. John, and this is John from Liverpool, England. How and when were Gentiles saved? That's the general point. Concerning Gentile salvation in the Old Testament, we start by affirming that salvation for both Jews and Gentiles depended on loyalty to Yahweh. Okay, and I like that. That's good. We start by affirming that salvation for both Jews and Gentiles, wouldn't that be just like Yahweh, to be consistent for everyone, depended on loyalty to Yahweh. Now, it's a loaded statement that we have to work through. But keep going. Jews evidence this loyalty by following Torah. Fair enough. And again, let's unpack that. We're not talking about obedience as though it's rote and doing things blindly, as we sometimes think of the Pharisees, tithing mint and cumin. But just think generally in the Old Testament, if you loved Yahweh, you would follow Torah. This is, Psalm 119. This is wonderful stuff, right? So Jews evidence their loyalty by following Torah, while Gentiles were not expected to do so. Think of the Naaman story where he's healed by the dipping in the Nile, or why can't I remember the name of a river when I need to? The Jordan 7 times. He doesn't convert to Judaism, Naaman. He's a Syrian, but he goes back to Syria and seems to be proper in the mind of the writer as a Gentile. So as John ends by saying, and there's more parts to this, but let's just leave it with this, were Gentiles saved then only retrospectively? Now, what he means by that is, if we talk about Gentiles like a Naaman becoming right with God, are we saying that because we know how the story will go and that God himself will someday, as I have talked about Gentile atonement and things like this, are we saying that we should make this a retrospective thing for a Gentile, or are we saying that in the actual story itself, Gentiles were able to be right with God, saved, if we want to use that term, before the story itself gives reasons to see that person sanctified and so forth and so on? So this is a good chronological question. In other words, Peter's going to deny having dinner with Cornelius, and God will send down a sheet and say, what I've called common, or what I've called pure, don't call or holy, don't call common. And you have a lot of the story in chronological shape. What John's asking is, can I go back to the very beginning and just in my mind read the story saying, I don't care who you are, whenever you are, wherever you are, if you have loyalty to Yahweh, you're right with God. And all this discussion about the mechanisms and things like that are really unnecessary to the bigger story of how salvation works. Now, let me give you my quick opinion. I don't have any slides on this because, again, this could go so many directions. I didn't know how to even state my answer with slides. I save it for last today because I think what this is doing, this question for me, is grabbing at a lot of the other questions we've had in one way or another in these last 3 podcasts that are asking for the big story. What is the biggest story of all? As I said, that person who nudges you and says, I want to become a Christian, and then they step out and break their neck and, that sort of thing. We all agree that that person is right with God because of the simple desire to be his person, to invite Yahweh to be his deity, something like that, even though they may not use that term. That's the point. I mean, how many of us ever prayed the sinner's prayer with those words? But to John's point, can we simply simplify the whole story down to the level of all you have to do is worship the right deity? I am of the opinion that yes, that is the way to go. And it would be this analogy. It's as simple as getting in the car and pushing on the gas. That's how I drive my car. If the salesman can say, if you get in that car, hold the steering wheel and push on this pedal, it's going to work and it's going to amaze you. Okay? Now, another person may want to know about the carburation, and do they still make carburetors? I don't even know. And they want to know about the drivetrain, and they want to know about the EV stuff versus the gas stuff. I mean, all the stuff that's in these new cars. I had my first experience of driving a car. I was a rental car this last weekend, and every time I come to a stoplight, it turned off. It's like, what's going on here? And I would take my foot off the gas, and it would start up again. Well, I guess that's how they make cars nowadays, right? But there's a lot of, think of the engineering that goes into that. My point being, do I need to know that, or can I just push on the gas pedal and be okay? I think, and with this I close, But I think it's a huge point to be made. In the DCW mindset that I have, all the mechanisms, transactions, intricacies, engineering that goes into the biblical story from front end to the back end. And I mean, we're talking about everything. Image of God in man, fall, rebellious spirits, allotment to man, Babel, reversal of Babel in Acts 2. I mean, all these things that Mike was wonderful, putting these dots together. And we've been celebrating that for years now. And we're doing it even on our podcast. Can we push all that aside with reverence and with thanksgiving and say to a child, all you got to do is love God and let it go at that? And now, again, that child, if they say yes, welcome to welcome to Awana, welcome to church, welcome to Bibles, welcome to college, welcome to reading, every book you can get your hand on. It's going to be a world of knowledge, a world of learning. But if you want to know how to enjoy this thing called Christianity, just push that gas pedal. Just keep on that gas pedal. I guess I'm there, Mike. And maybe this is too simple of a response to John's good question, but I think we can easily be, and I personally can be easily defined as looking at the gravel too much and trying to be too specific on things. When in my mind's eye, I'm getting old enough to where, and I've got six grandkids now, I see in their eyes the need not for the minutia, but for the big story. And just keep Jesus in front of them. Keep God in front of them in such a way that if they push that gas pedal, they're in. And of course, I want them to learn the intricacies as they have time and desire. But I just say to this last question, were Gentiles saved only retrospectively? Absolutely not. That's where I'm going with this. No, don't do that to the story. You're saved, you're right with God because you love God. And all this material that goes into a story, take it as a great story, but don't undo the gospel itself because of it. So, kind of rambling there, but I hope it made sense. Any thoughts?
It reminds me of when we were talking about how did we have a Melchizedek? And how did we have, later on in Exodus, how did we have a Jethro?
Mm-hmm.
Right? It goes back, right, to what was one of the original purposes of Deuteronomy 32, of Genesis 10 and 11, of God, of Yahweh basically saying, I'm going to focus my time on this one little small family, Abraham. The rest of the peoples, I'm going to have under the guardianship of these other Elohim.
Mm-hmm.
But why is it by Psalm 82, he's essentially saying, most of you are doing a terrible job mm-hmm. and not taking care of these other people like I wanted you to. Yeah. And yet, every so often, all of a sudden, we read of a person like Melchizedek or a person like Jethro. And I wonder, and I did ask Mike this before he passed, is that maybe an indication? And he actually, this was in response to a question someone asked him. Do we know the names? How can we find out the names of the Elohim, of the divine beings who stayed loyal to Yahweh? Mm-hmm. And his response is, we would never find out their names, because if they were doing their jobs correctly, they would never be telling anyone their own names. They would only be telling them the name of Yahweh. Mm-hmm. They would be pointing the people back to the Creator, not to them, if they were actually loyal, if they were doing their jobs. Mm-hmm. So we would never actually know their names. That's the point. And so, I do wonder, who told Melchizedek?
Yeah, who told to be who he was? Sure.
Yeah, and who told Jethro? It's just this interesting thing of that we get hints that there were some who were loyal, but we don't have definite proof. But because that's not part of the necessary information that we're told, we're given just enough to know. But I would agree with you, Ron, that were the Gentiles saved only retrospectively? No. That God ultimately had always wanted all of his creation, including all humanity, to actually come to know him. And that what Babel ultimately showed was I got to start small, and I got to start with one family, and I got to convince this one family to follow me wholeheartedly so that they can then tell other families, you really ought to follow this creator wholeheartedly, because look what happened with us when we did.
Yeah.
And to actually show by real life example, this is why being loyal to the creator matters. And so, I don't know. I think sometimes we do get, yes, I agree with you that we get caught up in the minutia, or we get obsessed with the machination. And we forget that at the heart of it, it is the chase after the creator. And the creator revealed, this is how you best chase after me. Emulate and become more and more like my son. Right? Who is also creator. It's like there's just that story. And that's the reason why the gospel can be understood by a little child.
Yeah, that's the main point there. Yep, I totally agree. So thank you for your thoughts on top of mine. We're so good at the story and saying this caused this and this caused this. And I'm recommending, as you are there, that keep the foot on the gas pedal and don't worry about the zoom you have, right? You got a Mazda?
Yep.
I think I drove a Mazda, and that's what was pretty exciting this weekend.
Love those cars.
Enjoy the zoom. And so with that, let's close. And again, thank you, everyone. Please keep your questions coming. I do love them. I really do. questions.dcwp@gmail.com. We collect them, and we will get to it. We've had 3 weeks now, 3 podcasts of Q&A. We will return next time to finish out the next 3 podcasts. We'll take John 19, 20, and 21 and finish on a high note, of course, with talking about the purpose of the book, as well as meeting again the beloved disciple and how that story will go. All right. Thank you, Mike. And thank you, everyone. Until we meet again next week, have a blessed week. We'll talk again.